Hi everyone, I'm Ethne Gale. Today I'm going to be talking about how to do a short fiction submission, and I'm going to be doing a submission of my own. First, you want to make sure that you have a polished piece of short fiction that's ready to submit to publishers. This means that the words are the best that they can be and that you've done at least a couple of passes to weed out any typos or grammatical errors. Most publishers aren't going to just dismiss your piece for one or two mistakes, but if there are more than a couple of typos or obvious grammatical errors for no good reason, then they might see your manuscript as unprofessional. When you're ready to submit, the next step is to find a publisher to submit to. You can find an appropriate publisher in a variety of ways. Maybe a friend told you about them or you saw their Twitter account. But 99% of the time, I find the publishers that I submit to through Duotrope. Duotrope is an online database of publishers and agents. It's got some great search functionality, lets you track your submissions, and also offers other services like a weekly newsletter with new publishers, defunct publishers, and themed submission calls. I'm not sponsored by Duotrope, but I have used it for 8 years, and I have their permission to share some footage of me using the site with you all. Of course, you don't need Duotrope to submit. They are a paid service that I pay about $50 Australian per year to use. There is also a free service called the Submissions Grinder that works in a very similar way. But today I'm going to be showing you Duotrope because I personally use Duotrope. So conveniently for this video, I just recently finished a new science fiction story and I'm ready to submit it. I need to re-record a lot of this video because the screen recording software that I was using for the first time around didn't quite work properly. So I've now got new screen recording software, a new haircut, and I'm ready to submit again. The first time around I submitted my story to Clarkesworld. This time, let's see. So the first thing that I do when I'm ready to submit a story is I go to www.duotrope.com and it brings me up this lovely home screen. I think the first thing that a lot of people would do would be to put their story into standard manuscript format. That's not the first thing that I do because there are some markets that don't want standard manuscript format, so I would want to know where I was submitting before I formatted my story in a particular way. So from the home screen, I would go to search and search for publishers. And this will bring me up Duotrope's lovely search form where I can enter in all of this information about my story and what I'm looking for in a publisher, and it will bring me up a list of potentially appropriate publishers that I can then work through. So the first thing that I want to put in is the genre. My story is a science fiction story. Style, I usually leave blank because I find that that narrows the field of publishers that comes up too much. The same thing for topic. Length, I do indeed want to put in. It is a short story and the number of words I know is 5,253. If I wasn't sure of the specific amount of words at this point, I would go into my word processor and I would check to make sure that I had that specific number right. Minimum payment. We've got a few options here. We've got any, token, semi-pro, and pro. So for those who are unfamiliar with Duotrope's definitions here, pro is 5 cents US per word or more, semi-pro is 1 cent US per word or more, token is less than that 1 cent US per word but still paying something, and if I put any here into the form, that would also bring up non-paying markets. So for this particular story, I have only submitted it to Clarkesworld before and it is still very new, so I'm going to say that I want, at minimum, a semi-pro payment. Submission type, I could do postal or electronic. I never click postal. I don't want something that I have to submit in the mail, so I'm going to specify that I only want to submit electronically. Over here, we've got the on Duosuma tick box. Duosuma is Duotrope's new submissions manager. I've used it a few times. It seems to be pretty good, but I don't want to restrict the markets that come up to just the ones on Duosuma. So I'm going to leave that for now. Down here, we've got whether the publisher accepts reprints. So that would be if your story had been published before and you want to try and sell it again. One really good thing to note here is that if your story has been put on the internet at all before, whether that's on your personal website or on a forum or on your Patreon or anything like that, most publishers will consider that to have been previously published. So if you wanted to sell that story that had, for instance, appeared on your website before, then you would have to sell that as a reprint. You could potentially do that, but it's just something really important to keep in mind. Over here, we've got the Allow Simultaneous Submissions box. I would click that if I wanted only markets to come up that allowed me to submit my piece to them and other markets at the same time. There are a lot of markets that want to consider your piece exclusively, meaning that you could only submit your piece to them until you had a response from them. So until they had said, yes, we want it, or no, we don't want it, you couldn't submit that piece somewhere else. So if you do want to submit to multiple markets at once, click that Allow Simultaneous Submissions box. That's not something that I'm worried about today, so I'm not going to click it. Over on the right, we've got subgenre and audience, lifestyle and topic. I don't usually put anything in these fields because, again, I feel like it narrows my results too much. The same for subtopic here. Then royalties, I don't usually bother with. I'm much more concerned with what I guess the base rate of pay will be, and royalties will just be a bonus on top of that. So I'm going to leave that blank. Submissions medium, this is a new field that Duotrope has only recently introduced. It's in beta, but basically it means what format is your submission in. Now, the format that I'm submitting in is text, but I don't imagine there is any market that I might be considering that is not going to take text. So in this instance, I'm actually just going to leave that empty. Publication medium, I'm going to leave this unspecified as well, but if this mattered to me, so for instance, if I only wanted my story to be published in print or I only wanted my story to be published in audio, I could specify that here. And the last box that we've got down the bottom here is accepts multiples. So that's if it was important to me to be able to submit multiple pieces to the same market at once. That's not something that I am going to be doing today, so I'm going to leave that blank. And then down the bottom here, we have the sort by field. So I can select to sort my results by pay, average response time, acceptance ratio, or submissions reported. I usually sort by pay these days, but if I was wanting a quick response time, I could sort by average response time, or if I wanted to know what markets had a higher acceptance ratio, so they were accepting more of the stories that were being submitted to them, I could sort by that as well. So today I'm going to go with pay high to low, especially because this story hasn't been submitted to many places already. And I want to know which ones that are higher paying are available to me. I'm going to go with pay high low and search. So it brings me up the search results. I've got 26 matches found. That's not bad, especially because I've filtered out any market that pays below semi-pro rates. So at this point, I'm going to have a look through this list and I'm going to open up the listings for markets that might possibly be a good fit. This first one is an anthology with a theme that I know my story doesn't fit into, so I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to open up Amazing Stories, Analog Science Fiction and Fact, Apex Magazine, Asimov Science Fiction, Clark's World I submitted to the first time that I did this video, and they have already rejected my piece, so I'm not going to open them again. Escape Pod, Future Science Fiction Digest, I'm not very familiar with them, I'll open them up. This award, I would usually not be as interested in awards because they're not, they're not publishing a certain amount of fiction on a regular basis. They're just sort of looking for winners or finalists, and that's generally less appealing to me. Metastella, I think I might have something there already, but I will open this up and check. Reckoning has a particular environmental theme, which my story doesn't fit into, and Strange Horizons has a very specific submission window in terms of time. I think they're open for 24 hours a week, and this is not that 24 hours, so I'm not going to open them. Here's another award. That's probably enough listings that I've opened up for now to consider. I'm just having a quick look at these semi-pro to pro markets to see if there's anything here that jumps out at me as a really good fit. Doesn't particularly, so I'm going to have a look at the listings for the markets that I've already opened. So let's start with the first one here on the list, Amazing Stories. We've got a bit of background on Amazing Stories. They are a well-established, reputable magazine. You can see here that they publish electronically and in print, and we've got the frequency listed as well. They're only open to science fiction as a genre. They've got the lengths here. Given that I put the genre and the length of my story into Duotrope search form, hopefully Duotrope has already taken care of that, but it's always good to double check. They pay a professional payment rate. They take electronic submissions. They don't take postal submissions. They don't take reprints. They don't take simultaneous submissions, and the media that they take is text format. So that's all good to know. They've got details for poetry and visual art submissions, but I'm not concerned with them for this submission. Now we've got some very useful submission statistics. So you can see that they have received 215 reports from 116 Duotrope members within the past 12 months. So that is completed submission reports, meaning that the submission has been made and a response has come back from the market. Of these completed submission responses, the average response time is 19.3 days. So that's pretty quick in the scheme of things. You can see that the minimum response time is 0 days. So some people have been responded to on the same day that they've submitted, so very quickly. And then there's also someone, at least one person, who has had the response take 163 days. So quite a bit longer there. But the average is this 19.3. The response percent is 98.14%, so that's a really nice high response rate. You can see that there are 0.47% of submissions accepted by the market, but that's of the ones reported Duotrope. So the overall percentage of submissions accepted is actually going to be lower when you consider all of the submissions that were made to Amazing Stories but not reported to Duotrope as well. You've got the percentage of rejections and non-responses and lost and returned, and there's also a never responded option which no one has entered anything into. So that's good to know that they are so consistent with responses. They've also got a small amount of withdrawals, meaning that someone has withdrawn their submission from consideration. Over here we've got pending submissions, so you can see that there are currently 22 submissions pending a response from Duotrope members, meaning that of these 22 responses that Amazing Stories still haven't responded to, the average is 77.5 days waiting. You can see that someone has been waiting for quite a long time, but other people have only just submitted, so that's why that 0 minimum is there. Between this pending information and the completed response times, you can get a fairly good idea of approximately how long you'll probably be waiting for a response and how the market is doing. Other information that can help you with this is here it says the most recent response reported was received on the 20th of November. So that's very recent. You know that they're active, they're still sending responses. They haven't, stopped sending any responses for the last month, for instance, which some markets do. And responses have been received for submissions sent as recently as the 12th of November. So you know that they're responding to submissions that have been made recently as well. So they haven't been only dealing with submissions that have been in their backlog for 4 months, for instance. You can also view the report of recent responses from this market. It brings us up a list of some of the most recent responses. You can see that they all seem to be rejections, and from the days here, it looks like they're generally between the kind of 5 to 20 day mark, with some outliers in there as well. There's a rewrite request here, and if someone had been accepted, that would also be shown in this report. A little bit more information here. We've got work submitted to Amazing Stories was also submitted to all of these other kind of similar magazines, so that might be useful to you. And there's a members accepted here, also had work accepted by field, but Duotrope has insufficient data to be able to fill that in, which is probably because Amazing Stories does accept a very small amount of the submissions that are sent to them. So Amazing Stories seems like a pretty good fit so far for my piece. So I'm going to open their website to have a better look at in a little bit. I'm going to look at the next Duotrope listing, which is Analog Science Fiction and Fact, another well-regarded established magazine. So they want hard science fiction in particular, it looks like, which my story isn't really, so that means that I feel like maybe that's less of a good fit. They also take really quite a long time to respond, so their average response time is 110.4 days. That's a bit longer than I would generally like to consider. I usually don't submit to markets with an average response time of more than about 90 days. So I'm going to close Analog Science Fiction and Fact for now. I don't think they're such a good fit for me. Apex magazine. So they're wanting a lot of dark things, dark fantasy, science fiction, horror, that kind of thing. I don't think that my story is going to be dark enough for them, so I'm going to close that for now as well. Asimov Science Fiction. So they say that they are particularly looking for character-oriented stories. My story is not really very character-oriented, so I'm thinking maybe it's not such a good fit for these guys either. So I'm going to close that. Escape Pod, they're an audio magazine. Nice quick response time. So there's nothing here that makes me think that my story would not be a good fit for them, so I'm going to open their website as well. The next one is Future Science Fiction Digest. So there's a limited demographic here. They only want submissions from people whose first language is not English and who live outside of English-speaking countries. So that doesn't apply to me, which is completely fine, but that's not a magazine for me to submit to, so I'm going to close that. Metastella, I wasn't sure if I had something out here. So this is all looking fine, and so this is useful. This section is my submissions. So if I had reported any submissions to Metastella in the past, they would be coming up here and they would tell me which pieces I had submitted to Metastella and when I had submitted them. So Metastella, I can definitely continue to consider submitting to. I don't have anything there that would stop me from sending my new piece. So I'm going to open them up as well. So that has taken me to the end of the markets that I opened up from the search form. I am going to have a better look at the websites that I've opened up. I'm not going to show you a lot of the screen recordings for these websites and these markets because I haven't got specific permission from them to show you. So I'm going to talk through what I'm looking at. So here I am on the Amazing Stories website. I can go into their magazine menu and submissions and click on submissions. And from there I can click on guidelines and story guidelines. So they talk about a couple of different special theme issues. There is Home Sweet Solar System and Everything Computes, My story wouldn't fit into either of those themes, so I'm just going to check that they also want unthemed submissions, which they do. They talk about wanting to see some more optimistic science fiction, which is a good descriptor of my new story, so that's a good sign. So they reiterate their length and payment. The payment is 8 cents a word, which is very nice. They talk about the rights that they buy. So they buy first world publication rights, which means that they buy the right to publish your story for the first time in the world. They're also buying non-exclusive electronic archival rights in perpetuity. So that's the right to have your story published electronically under their website or in whatever electronic form Amazing Stories exists in for as long as they exist. And the right for non-exclusive publication in the quarterly issue. So that's the right to publish your story in their quarterly issue, which is both ebook and print on demand, they say, but it's non-exclusive, meaning that it doesn't stop you from publishing your story as a reprint somewhere else while it's published in that quarterly issue. And the final thing that they specify here in terms of rights is that they ask for non-exclusive rights to republish the story in an anthology for a separate fee. So that would be presumably negotiated with authors later if that was desired. They specify that they do publish reprints, but they're always solicited by the publisher, so not to submit any reprints to them. They say stories must be submitted using their online submission system, which will open starting on a date which they will announce. So the phrasing makes it sound like that it's not open now and it will open in the future, but the Duotrope submission statistics makes me think that they are open, so I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. At the bottom of their guidelines, they talk about using standard manuscript format, but to not include your name on the manuscript. So essentially they use a anonymous form of standard manuscript format, so you could put your submission into standard manuscript format and then remove your name. Let's talk for a minute about standard manuscript format. If you type standard manuscript format into Google, one of the first results that comes up is classic manuscript format under William Shun's website. So that's shun.net, which is the most popular and standard website for the short fiction community to reference when it comes to standard manuscript format. A really good thing to note about standard manuscript format is that there is now 2 versions. There is a classic and a modern. The key difference between the two is that modern uses Times New Roman as the standard font, and where classic would use underline for emphasis, modern uses italics. There are lots of little formatting details that you need to take into account when you're putting your story into standard manuscript format, which I won't go through in this video because that would be a video in and of itself. I do still bring up the shun.net standard manuscript format instructions for myself every time I put a story into standard manuscript format to make sure I'm not forgetting anything, so feel free to do that yourself. You don't have to memorize the instructions and then not reference them again later. Now I am looking at the Escape Pod website. They have a nice clear submissions menu. I want their submissions guidelines. They specify that they publish their stories in text and audio, but audio is their primary format, so stories need to be appropriate for that. They give a list of content that they don't want to see in stories submitted to them, which are things like gore or horror. They say they've published stories with that kind of content in the past, but they're not currently a good fit. So my story doesn't have anything like that, so that's fine for this particular submission. They take original fiction between 1,500 and 6,000 words, and above that, they do take submissions, but only for reprints, which is very interesting. They also pay 8 cents a word for original fiction, very nice. They tell you exactly what they want in a cover letter, which I really appreciate. They want your legal name, the story's title and word count, whether your story is an original or a reprint, up to 3 previous publications that you have, and any relevant personal experience related to the story, which is pretty much what I would consider to be a standard cover letter. And they also want an anonymous version of standard manuscript format. In terms of rights, they specify that they publish in both text and audio and that you're offering both of those one-time and archival rights when you send them your story. And they've got a sample contract, which is very nice. And they accept submissions via their Moksha submissions page. And the last place that I am going to look at is Metastella. So this looks like an instance where what was on Duotrope isn't exactly right for what is happening in the market right now, because markets do close and open and they don't always update this sort of thing on Duotrope. So the submission deadline for their last submission cycle looks like it was November 1st. It is beyond that, and it doesn't look like that they are currently open for short story submissions. So Metastella is not an option to submit to right now. I've narrowed it down to 2 options at this point, Amazing Stories or Escape Pod. Both look like they would be good choices for my story. I'm going to go with Amazing Stories in this instance. I found that they are in fact open, even though that wasn't very clear from their guidelines text. From their guidelines, you can go to the top right-hand corner of their page and click on Login, which allows you to submit. So now that I've logged in, I'm going to click on Submit a Story, which brings me up a form to fill in. I'm going to fill in the story title, the number of words, the type of story, which is science fiction, the cover letter. So I'm just double checking that there is nothing in their guidelines that tells me exactly what they want to see in their cover letter, because some markets are very specific about how they want your cover letter to be structured. But Amazing Stories does not give you any kind of particular information that they want to see or not see in a cover letter. So I'm going to use what I would consider to be kind of my standard cover letter, which is something like, "Dear editors, please find attached my story name, approximately X number of words, for your consideration. My fiction has been previously published in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Constellatory Tales, and Daily Science Fiction. Best regards, Effany." And then I will upload the story. They accept .text, .doc, and .docx only. So I need to make sure that I'm uploading the right file, and as per their guidelines, they want standard manuscript format but anonymous. So I need to make sure that there is no identifying information in my file. So that's uploaded and I click Submit. Great, so I've submitted. Now that I've submitted, I want to go back to Duotrope and I want to report my submission so that it's logged there, so that I don't forget that I've submitted to Amazing Stories, and I've got that in my reports and logs for the future. So now that I have completed my submission, I'm back to the Amazing Stories Duotrope listing and I'm going to report that submission. So I'm going to click down here in Submission/Response. It has auto-filled this form with the market that I've sent the submission to, which is Amazing Stories. If I had submitted multiple pieces, I could click this box. I want to select the name of the piece that I have submitted to Amazing Stories so that it can record that piece as being submitted there. I'm not going to share the name of the story with you guys at this point because I tend to try and keep a lot of the information about my stories under wraps until they're accepted. So I will select the name of the piece sent, but I'm not going to show that to you right now. I could also click the I need to add a piece to my list link if this is the first time that I'm submitting this piece and I need to add it to my Duotrope list. So I'm going to scroll down. The date sent, the date that I've submitted the piece is today. Date acknowledged. I could put a date in here later if Amazing Stories gets back to me and says we've received your submission. So that's what acknowledge means. It basically just means that they have acknowledged that you sent the submission and that they have received it. So again, I could put a date in here if I sent a query later on to check on the status of my submission. If a market is taking an unexpectedly long time to get back to you, you can send them a friendly query just asking whether your story is still under consideration or if something else has happened. So for example, there was a time where a market sent me a rejection, but it ended up in my spam folder and I never saw it. So I sent them a query to say, are you still looking at my piece? And they said, no, we sent you a rejection. So it was really helpful to be able to send that query and get clarity on what was happening with my story, and then I could resubmit it somewhere else. Response received, so when you receive your response from the market, whether that be an acceptance or rejection, you can mark the date that you received that response here. And that would essentially close the submission. So submission status, at the moment it is pending response, but again, I could go back and update this later and put acceptance, rejection, or whatever the status of the submission is. Submission method, it is electronic. And I can then click report. Great, so that's it. We submitted a story to a market. You got a bit of an idea of what my search process is on Duotrope. You can do something very similar either on Duotrope or the submissions grinder to find potential markets and then evaluate those markets and then submit. I hope you enjoyed this submissions deep dive. Give me a like if you did and subscribe if you want to see similar videos in the future. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.